something about the desktop environment whose reputation the Linux community has been building across the years of the Cinnamon project's development as the response to the design philosophy, whose imposition on the Linux desktop user, the GNOME 3's radical departure from the familiar computing paradigm performed as the unsolicited transformation that the Linux Mint development team's Cinnamon creation rejected as the unnecessary disruption of the productive computing environment, whose familiar character, the traditional desktop layout, the taskbar's bottom panel presence, and the application menu's hierarchical organization together establish as the productivity foundation, whose preservation the Cinnamon project's founding motivation identified as the primary design commitment rather than the visual novelty whose pursuit the competing desktop environment's radical redesign prioritized as the innovation expression at the user productivity's expense has been quietly, systematically, and with the patient accumulation of the release cycle's iterative improvement building toward the specific version whose arrival announces not the incremental refinement, but the transformative maturity whose achievement the Cinnamon 6.0 release represents as the foundational upgrade that the Linux community's largest traditional desktop user population has been building toward as the destination whose arrival the release cycle's accumulated momentum finally delivers as the present reality rather than the anticipated future. Cinnamon 6.0 just dropped, and the difference between what Linux Mint's flagship desktop was before this release and what it has become after this release is the difference that the changelog's dry technical enumeration of the fixed bugs and the added features consistently fails to communicate as the experiential transformation whose character the daily computing encounter with the updated environment reveals as the qualitative departure from the incremental pattern into the foundational achievement territory. The most powerful update ever, whose characterization this examination defends, as the accurate description is the update whose power the 6 specific dimensions of the architectural modernization, the Wayland preparation, the rendering performance, the Applet ecosystem, the system integration depth, and the accessibility advancement together constitute as the simultaneous delivery whose combination the single release version achieves as the platform transformation rather than the feature addition, whose incremental character the isolated improvement's modest characterization would accurately describe as the marginal refinement. Here is the specific documentation of what Cinnamon 6.0 actually delivers, whose honest examination the most powerful update ever characterization requires as the evidential foundation, rather than the enthusiastic assertion whose validation the evidence's honest communication provides as the substantive basis rather than the promotional framing whose inflation the engagement optimization produces at the accurate characterization's expense. Here is the architectural modernization whose completion the release achieves as the foundational reconstruction rather than the surface refinement. Here is the Wayland preparation whose advancement the release delivers as the display architecture's generational transition, whose production deployment the enterprise Linux desktop's reliability requirement demanded as the confidence standard. Here is the rendering performance transformation, whose measurement the honest benchmark comparison produces as the finding that challenges the performance narrative. Here is the Applet ecosystem's revolution, whose developer experience improvement and the user capability expansion together establish as the platform's extensibility transformation. Here is the system integration depth, whose improvement the release delivers as the daily workflow's seamless operation. And here is the accessibility advancement whose humanitarian significance the disabled user community's computing independence establishes as the consequential improvement rather than the cosmetic adjustment. The first dimension of Cinnamon 6.0's most powerful update characterization is the architectural modernization whose completion the release achieves as the GTK4 migration's progression and the Muffin compositor's reconstruction, whose combination produces the foundational platform whose modern architecture the previous Cinnamon version's GTK3 foundation's limitations prevented as the architectural ceiling. The GTK4 migration's significance for the Cinnamon 6.0 user, whose daily computing the desktop environment powers as the operational foundation, is the significance of the rendering performance, whose improvement the modern toolkit's GPU acceleration enables as the measurable responsiveness enhancement that the legacy GTK3 rendering pipeline's software rendering approaches performance ceiling, the GTK4 hardware acceleration exceeds as the architectural advancement. The Muffin compositor's reconstruction, whose completion the Cinnamon 6.0 release delivers as the rendering pipeline's modernization, addresses the specific visual quality concerns whose documentation across the Cinnamon community's feedback channels established as the development priority whose response the compositor reconstruction's investment represents as the direct user experience. Improvement. The frame timing consistency, whose improvement the reconstructed compositor delivers, as the animation smoothness, the window transitions visual quality, and the desktop interactions responsiveness together produce as the daily computing experiences qualitative transformation that the previous compositor's frame scheduling limitations prevented as the achievable quality standard. The architectural modernization's practical significance for the Linux Mint user whose Cinnamon adoption, the familiar desktop paradigm's preservation motivated as the computing environment whose disruption the radical redesign's alternative would impose as the unnecessary challenge, is the significance of the platform whose surface continuity preserves the familiar productivity. Environment, while the architectural reconstruction beneath the surface delivers the modern foundation whose capability the legacy architecture's constraints prevented as the achievable implementation. The familiar taskbar, the familiar application menu, and the familiar desktop paradigm continue as the preserved productivity environment, while the architectural foundation's modernization delivers the performance, the rendering quality, and the future capability whose construction the modern architecture enables as the forward foundation rather than the legacy limitation. The second dimension of Cinnamon 6.0's most powerful update characterization is the Wayland preparation, whose advancement the release delivers as the display architecture's generational transition whose production readiness the enterprise Linux desktop's deployment confidence requires as the reliability standard whose attainment the Wayland implementation's maturity represents as the validated capability rather than the experimental feature. The Wayland preparation's specific improvements, whose combination produces the display experience's advancement, include the X-Wayland compatibility layers enhancement, whose implementation ensures the X11 application's Wayland session execution as the seamless experience rather than the compatibility barrier, whose presence the legacy application's Wayland adoption would create as the workflow disruption. The Cinnamon development team's Wayland sessions stability improvement, whose testing the release cycle's extended validation period performed as the quality assurance represents the enterprise deployment's confidence foundation, whose construction the production-ready characterization requires as the evidence basis rather than the experimental deployment's tolerance for the instability that the production environment's reliability standard cannot accept as the operational characteristic. The fractional scaling implementation, whose Wayland session advancement the Cinnamon 6.0 release delivers as the high DPI display technology's Linux desktop support improvement, addresses the specific user experience failure whose persistence across the Linux desktop's high DPI display encounter. The Sharp Display technology's Linux adoption limitation documented as the hardware investment whose software environment's inadequate exploitation. The fractional scaling's previous implementation created as the user experience gap. The developer whose 4K display the fractional scaling's improved implementation now correctly renders at the 150% scaling factor, experiences the Cinnamon 6.0 release's immediately visible improvement as the daily computing environment's visual quality enhancement whose persistence the improved implementation delivers as the permanent improvement rather than the workaround's fragility, whose maintenance the previous implementation's incomplete solution required as the ongoing concern. The third dimension of Cinnamon 6.0's most powerful update characterization is the rendering performance transformation, whose measurement, the honest benchmark comparison between Cinnamon 6.0 and the preceding versions, produces as the finding that challenges the performance narrative with the specific data, whose communication the promotional coverage's feature focus sometimes displaces as the secondary consideration when the performance data is the primary relevance to the user's daily computing experience. The memory consumption reduction, whose achievement the Cinnamon 6.0 memory management improvements deliver as the measurable outcome the system monitors comparison of the idle desktop's RAM utilization across the version boundary documents as the quantifiable improvement. The idle Cinnamon 6.0 desktop's memory consumption, whose comparison with the equivalent Cinnamon 5.x measurement the honest benchmark produces as the finding reveals the architectural modernization's resource efficiency dividend as the measurable improvement whose daily computing impact the application. Performance's indirect benefit reflects as the available memory, whose liberation the desktop environment's reduced consumption achieves as the resource availability improvement. The application responsiveness, whose improvement the Cinnamon 6.0 rendering pipeline's optimization delivers as the launch time reduction and the window operation's snappiness together produce as the qualitative experience improvement the daily computing encounter validates as the genuine advancement rather than the synthetic benchmark whose laboratory measurement the production usage replaces as the authentic assessment. The file manager's launch, the settings panel's opening, and the application switcher's display whose timed measurement the honest performance comparison requires as the representative sample together produce the consistent finding that the Cinnamon 6.0's architectural modernization delivers as the performance improvement whose daily computing impact, the responsive environment's qualitative character, reflects as the computing pleasure rather than the technical specification. The fourth dimension of Cinnamon 6.0's most powerful update characterization is the Applet ecosystem's revolution, whose developer experience improvement and user capability expansion together establish as the platform's extensibility transformation, whose significance the Cinnamon desktop's distinctive strength as the customizable traditional paradigm establishes as the relevant capability domain. The Spices platform, whose Cinnamon Applet, theme, extension, and desklet distribution the Linux Mint project maintains as the ecosystem infrastructure, has been enhanced in the Cinnamon 6.0 release as the developer API's modernization, the installation process's reliability improvement, and the management interface's usability advancement together constitute as the ecosystem infrastructure's comprehensive improvement whose developer experience. Enhancement, the modern API's capability. Breadth enables as the Applet development platform whose quality the developer community's Applet creation investment depends on as the productivity infrastructure. The Applet developer whose Cinnamon Applet the modern API's capability enables as the implementation option discovers in the Cinnamon 6.0 ecosystem the development platform whose quality the previous version's API limitations prevented as the achievable implementation. The system monitoring applet whose real-time performance visualization the modern API's graphical capability enables, the productivity integration applet whose calendar and task management the modern API's system service access provides as the workflow enhancement, and the media control applet whose streaming service integration the modern API's network capability supports as the entertainment convenience, together demonstrate the modern API's practical capability as the Applet ecosystem's expansion, whose user experience benefit the diverse Applet libraries availability produces as the daily computing enhancement. The fifth dimension of Cinnamon 6.0's most powerful update characterization is the system integration depth whose improvement the release delivers through the enhanced files application, the improved system settings architecture, and the refined notification system whose combination produces the productivity application suite, whose integration completeness the daily workflow's seamless operation requires as the practical foundation. The system settings architecture whose rationalization the Cinnamon 6.0 release implements as the information. Architecture's improvement addresses the specific usability concern, whose documentation in the community feedback the development team's response prioritized as the evidence-based redesign rather than the aesthetic preference, whose subjective character the user research's objective finding replaces as the design decision's foundation. The settings search functionality, whose improvement the Cinnamon 6.0 system settings delivers as the cross-panel search, whose implementation finds the setting whose location the user cannot remember as the navigation alternative, transforms the settings interaction from the location knowledge requirement into the search-driven interaction whose accessibility the natural search behavior enables as the immediate pathway to the desired configuration. The files application whose Cinnamon 6.0 update improves as the network share integrations enhancement, the bookmark synchronization's reliability improvement, and the file operations feedback refinement together constitute as the file management experience, whose practical improvement, the daily file operations frequent execution, makes the significant enhancement rather than the cosmetic adjustment whose visual character the surface change implies as the modest improvement. The file operations progress feedback, whose Cinnamon 6.0 implementation delivers as the detailed status communication provides the user with the operation's completion estimate, the transfer rate, and the error condition's specific identification as the actionable information, whose previous absence the vague progress indicator's imprecise communication created as the user uncertainty that the improved feedback's specific provision eliminates as the informational clarity. The notification system whose Cinnamon 6.0 refinement delivers as the notification grouping improvement, the Do Not Disturb modes enhancement, and the notification action's reliability improvement together constitute the attention management infrastructure whose quality the focused work environment's construction depends on as the distraction management capability. The grouped notification whose presentation consolidates the application's multiple alerts into the single notification entry whose expansion the user's interested engagement performs as the deliberate information access rather than the involuntary interruption, whose imposition the ungrouped notifications sequential delivery creates as the attention fragmentation that the grouped design eliminates as the architectural improvement. The sixth dimension of Cinnamon 6.0's most powerful update characterization is the accessibility advancement whose significance the disabled user community's computing independence establishes as the humanitarian consequence of the technical work, whose communication the technology presses feature coverage consistently underweights as the specialist consideration rather than the platform's universal design commitment, whose expression the accessibility investment reflects as the foundational value rather than the compliance obligation, whose minimum satisfaction the accessibility checkbox is checking performs as the regulatory response rather than the genuine capabilities provision. The screen reader compatibility, whose improvement the Cinnamon 6.0 accessibility work advances as the ATSPI2 accessibility interface's comprehensive implementation, provides the visually impaired user, whose computing independence the screen reader's reliable application narration enables as the assistive technology's practical function with the application coverage completeness, whose improvement the Cinnamon 6.0 release represents as the accessibility platform's maturation. The core Cinnamon applications, whose screen reader compatibility the accessibility testing's validation confirms as the reliable narration experience across the Files application, the system settings, and the application launcher together provide the daily computing workflows accessibility coverage, whose completeness the independent computing experience's practical enablement requires as the minimum viable accessibility platform. The keyboard navigation completeness, whose achievement the Cinnamon 6.0 interaction design's accessibility investment delivers as the mouse-free workflows enablement addresses the specific accessibility requirement, whose satisfaction the physical disability's mouse operation limitation creates as the critical capability. The complete keyboard navigation, whose Cinnamon 6.0 implementation delivers, means that the keyboard-dependent user navigates the desktop environment, the application launcher, the notification system, and the system settings as the keyboard-exclusive workflow whose completion the mouse interaction's absence does not prevent as the missing requirement, but whose provision the keyboard navigation's completeness enables as the independent computing capability. The high-contrast theme, whose Cinnamon 6.0 implementation improves as the visual accessibility enhancement, whose application the low-vision user's display requirement motivates as the practical necessity rather than the aesthetic preference, provides the visual environment whose contrast ratio the accessibility standard defines as the minimum readable level, whose achievement the improved high contrast themes implementation delivers as the validated provision rather than the approximate approximation, whose inadequacy the previous implementation's contrast measurement revealed as the improvement opportunity. The Cinnamon 6.0 release, whose examination across the 6 dimensions this analysis has assembled as the evidential foundation for the most powerful update ever characterization, represents the Linux desktop's most widely deployed traditional paradigm's arrival at the platform maturity, whose achievement the multi-cycle development investment has been building toward as the destination. The architectural modernization, whose GTK4 progression and Muffin compositor reconstruction deliver as the foundational platform. The Wayland preparation, whose fractional scaling and X-Wayland compatibility together advance as the display architecture's generational transition. The rendering performance, whose memory reduction and application responsiveness the benchmark comparison documents. The Applet ecosystem's revolution, whose modern API and Spice's platform enhancement expand as the extensibility transformation. The system integration depth, whose settings rationalization and notification refinement improve as the daily workflow. The accessibility advancement, whose screen reader, compatibility, and keyboard navigation completeness deliver as the independent computing capability. These are the 6 dimensions whose simultaneous delivery in the single release version, the most powerful update characterization accurately describes as the evidential conclusion rather than the marketing assertion, whose inflation the engagement optimization would produce at the accurate characterization's expense. Cinnamon has been the Linux desktop whose user population the familiar paradigm's preservation and the Linux Mint's popularity together establish as the significant deployment whose underrepresentation in the desktop environment coverage the technically sophisticated audience's alternative preference creates as the coverage gap whose correction the honest assessment requires. Cinnamon 6.0 has delivered the release whose power the traditional desktop's user population deserves as the development investment's return. The most powerful update is installed. The familiar desktop has never been this capable. The productivity paradigm is preserved, the architectural foundation is modernized, and the user whose daily computing, the familiar taskbar, the familiar application menu, and the familiar desktop organization powers as the productive environment, experiences the most powerful update as the invisible revolution, whose surface continuity conceals the architectural transformation, whose depth, the performance measurement, the rendering quality, and the accessibility completeness together reveal as the foundational achievement. The most powerful update is not the disruption. It is the preservation of what works, elevated by the modernization of what powers it. Cinnamon 6.0 achieved both simultaneously, That is the most powerful update. And that is why nobody can stop the Linux desktop whose biggest traditional paradigm just became its most capable version.